Can you imagine a mother being treated as an uninvited guest at her own son's wedding? That was the question echoing in my heart as I stood outside the decorated hall, my hands trembling with both excitement and nervousness. For years I had dreamed of this day, the day I would see my son, my pride, dressed as a groom, walking toward a future I had sacrificed everything to build for him. I had sold my jewelry to help with the arrangements, taken loans quietly to cover costs no one else cared about, and poured every ounce of energy into making sure my son's special day was perfect. The hall sparkled with chandeliers. Guests whispered in admiration of the setup, and laughter filled the air. Everything looked grand, yet something felt painfully empty. When I entered, I expected to be greeted warmly, to be offered a seat in the front row, to be recognized as the mother of the groom. Instead, I was met with cold stares and whispers. One of the bride's relatives approached me and, without a smile, muttered, "Baji, the hall is very crowded. Can you please sit in the kitchen for now? It will be more comfortable." The words pierced through me like a blade. The kitchen. On my son's wedding day. I looked around, expecting someone to correct her, expecting my son to walk over and say, "This is my mother, she belongs with me." But silence filled the space. My son was busy greeting guests. His new in-laws were busy showing off, and I was left standing there, invisible. I swallowed my pain, forced a smile, and walked toward the kitchen. Every step felt heavier than the last. Inside, the aroma of curries and freshly baked bread filled the air, but all I could taste was bitterness. I sat on a small wooden chair in the corner, listening to the clapping and music coming from the hall. Tears burned my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. Instead, I whispered to myself, "Stay quiet. Observe. Sometimes silence is louder than words." From that small corner, I heard the bride's relatives laughing, gossiping about how they had won in this marriage. They spoke as if my sacrifices didn't exist, as if my son was theirs to control now. In that moment, something inside me shifted. I realized I was no longer the weak, desperate mother who would beg for respect. I was the woman who had built everything from the ground up, who had given her son not only life but also the wedding he stood in today. And if they thought they could erase me from the picture, they were deeply mistaken. I smiled again, but this time it was different. It wasn't the smile of defeat. It was the smile of quiet strength. I knew exactly what I would do, and it would be something no one expected. That night, while they celebrated in the hall, I made a silent vow to myself. This wedding may belong to them today, but tomorrow the choices will be mine. The clinking of glasses, bursts of laughter, and the upbeat hum of celebration floated through the walls of the kitchen as I sat there in my chair, staring at the faded linoleum floor beneath my feet. The smell of food, rich, aromatic, carefully prepared by a team of chefs, wafted around me, but the scent turned bitter in my chest. I was not hungry. I was humiliated. This was supposed to be my son's big day. A moment where a mother should have been seated proudly in the front row, tears of joy shining in her eyes, watching her child step into a new chapter of life. But instead, I had been tucked away in the back, like an inconvenience, like a forgotten guest who had stumbled in uninvited. I sat there quietly, letting the sting of it all wash over me. But beneath that silence, something was boiling. An ache that had little to do with the wedding and everything to do with the years that had led to this moment. How many times had I stayed up late, working overtime to make sure my son had the education he needed. How many mornings had I skipped meals so he could have enough for lunch? How many nights did I spend sewing his school uniforms, patching holes in his clothes so he wouldn't feel embarrassed among his classmates? And now, after all of that sacrifice, after pouring my life into him, I was cast aside on the very day that should have been as much about me as it was about him. I could still hear his voice from earlier, words I never thought I'd hear from my own child. "Mom, just sit here. It's better for everyone if you stay out of the way." The words were gentle enough on the surface, but they pierced through me like a dagger. Out of the way. I had been his way. Every step he had taken was carved out of the sacrifices I had made. And yet, to his bride and her family, I was nothing more than an extra, a distraction, a blemish on their perfect day. The kitchen staff passed by me now and then, their eyes darting awkwardly toward me, unsure of whether to offer a word of comfort or simply keep moving. I could see in their expressions that they understood what was happening. Everyone did. The shame of it made my cheeks burn, but I forced myself to sit upright, smoothing the wrinkles from my dress, the dress I had saved up for months to buy, thinking it would be a proud symbol of the mother of the groom. Now, it only felt like a costume for a role I was never allowed to play. I thought back to the day he told me he was getting married. His eyes had sparkled with excitement as he described her. "She's everything, Mom. Smart, kind, beautiful. You'll love her." And I had smiled, holding on to hope that she would see me as family, that she would embrace me the way I embraced the idea of her. But somewhere along the way, she had made it clear that in her picture-perfect life, I had no place. She wanted the house, the appearances, the polished image of a successful marriage, but not the reality of the woman who had built the foundation beneath it all. I clenched my hands in my lap, trying to steady the storm rising in my chest. My son may have allowed this treatment, but he had forgotten something crucial. I was not a woman to be dismissed lightly. I had endured far worse than humiliation, and I had always found a way to rise stronger. They may have thought they had silenced me, tucked me away in the kitchen like a ghost, but what they didn't know was that I was listening, observing, and planning. The laughter from the hall grew louder as the first dance began. I closed my eyes for a moment, imagining what it might have been like to be out there, smiling proudly, watching my son twirl his bride across the floor. The vision stung, but it also hardened something inside me. If they wanted me invisible, then invisible I would be, for now. But invisibility has its advantages. It lets you move quietly, unnoticed, until the moment you decide to strike. And I knew deep in my bones that the moment would come. The muffled sound of applause drifted through the door, signaling the end of the couple's first dance. I leaned back in my chair, my eyes fixed on the faint shadows that flickered across the kitchen wall as people passed by the doorway. Each cheer and burst of laughter from the reception hall felt like salt being rubbed into an open wound. I was no longer a guest in my own son's life. I had been reduced to a stranger, someone deemed unworthy of sitting among the important people. For a moment I thought about leaving, quietly walking out the back door, disappearing into the night, and letting them celebrate without me. But as quickly as the thought entered my mind, it twisted into something darker. Why should I leave? Why should I be the one to walk away with my head bowed, while they enjoyed the celebration I had partly paid for? My savings, my sacrifices, my efforts, All of them had gone into making this wedding possible. The very roof under which they were laughing had been reserved with my hard-earned money. And yet, they had the audacity to shove me into the kitchen like some shameful secret. No, I would not leave. I would sit and I would wait. When the waiter slipped into the kitchen carrying an empty tray, he gave me a sympathetic smile. "Would you like me to bring you something, ma'am?" he asked softly, as though afraid his kindness might be overheard. I shook my head. "No, thank you," I whispered. My voice was calm, almost too calm for the fire building inside me. As he walked away, I felt my lips curl into a bitter smile. I wasn't hungry for food. I was hungry for justice. I thought about all the years I had given up for my son. His father had left when he was young, leaving me to play both mother and father. I worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on, often coming home exhausted but still managing to help him with homework, listen to his dreams, and remind him he was capable of greatness. I had been his anchor, his guide, his cheerleader. And yet, here I was, repaid with disregard, cast aside like an afterthought. What cut even deeper was the look on his face earlier, when the bride's mother had whispered something to him and his expression hardened before he turned to me with those dismissive words. "Mom, just sit here. It's better this way." I realized he had made a choice. He had chosen her world over mine. He had chosen to protect her image rather than his mother's dignity. And that's when it hit me. He no longer saw me as the foundation of his life, but as a liability to his new one. That realization, sharp and cruel, gave me clarity. If they wanted me out of their picture-perfect story, then I would step out, but not before leaving a mark they would never forget. I reached into my purse and ran my fingers over the folded papers inside. Contracts, receipts, proof that every reservation, every payment for this wedding had gone through me. The venue deposit, the catering, the flowers, all of it tied back to my name. Without my financial support, there would be no glittering hall, no gourmet food, no shimmering decorations. They thought they had erased me, but in truth, I was the invisible hand holding up the very stage on which they were performing. And in that moment, as the laughter carried on outside, I made a silent vow. They would learn that dismissing me came at a cost they could never imagine. I adjusted my posture, smoothing the skirt of my dress again, this time not out of shame, but out of preparation. The kitchen may have been my prison for now, but I knew one thing with certainty. When I walked out of it, I wouldn't just be walking into the hall. I would be walking into the role of the woman who held all the strings. And I was ready to pull them. The music swelled again, this time a lively tune as guests flooded the dance floor. From the kitchen doorway, I caught glimpses of swirling dresses and flashing smiles. Glasses clinked, plates of steaming food were passed around, and the air buzzed with celebration. Yet here I sat, on a hard wooden chair tucked between stacked trays and crates of sparkling water, like I didn't belong. The contrast was almost surreal. On one side of the door a fairy tale. On the other, the forgotten mother who had made it all possible. The sound of my own heartbeat pounded louder than the music. My fingers drummed against my purse, restless and sharp. Every laugh felt like an insult, every cheer like a reminder that they believed I was invisible. But what they didn't realize, what none of them seemed to understand, was that my silence wasn't weakness. It was calculation. I replayed the scene in my head. My son standing tall in his tuxedo, the bride clinging to his arm like she'd won some great prize. Her lips had curved into that smug little smile when she instructed me to just sit in the back. Not even a back row, no, the kitchen. She had made sure I was out of sight, hidden away like a blemish on their perfect evening. And my son. He hadn't defended me. He hadn't hesitated. He had simply nodded, as if it were the most natural thing in the world to humiliate the woman who had raised him alone. A surge of heat rose to my chest, burning and heavy. For years I had poured every ounce of energy into him. I worked double shifts at the diner, scrubbed floors until my knees ached, and stretched every dollar so he never went without. I saved every penny I could for his education, skipped vacations, and ignored my own dreams just to make sure he stayed alive. And this was the thanks I got. I could have stormed into that hall, demanded my place at the table, created a scene that would be remembered for years. But that would make me exactly what they wanted me to be. Dramatic, embarrassing, someone they could point to and say, "See? That's why we hid her away."
Well,
If I was going to reclaim my dignity, it wouldn't be with noise. It would be with precision, with power. I reached into my purse and pulled out the thin folder I had tucked there days before. Inside were the contracts, each neatly clipped and signed. My name, bold and clear, was on every line. Venue, catering, flowers, decorations, even the band. Without me there was no wedding. Without me there was no glittering spectacle to post on social media or show off to friends. They had used me as a stepping stone, and now they thought they could cast me aside. But stepping stones, when pulled away, can make people stumble hard. The kitchen door swung open again, and one of the staff rushed in with an order slip. He glanced at me, confusion flickering across his face, as if he couldn't quite understand why someone dressed like a guest was sitting here among the crates and trays. I smiled politely, almost amused. He didn't know it, but he was witnessing the calm before the storm. I leaned back in my chair, my mind sharper than it had been in years. They thought I had no place in that hall. They thought I was powerless. But the truth was, I held the keys to everything. And when the time came to turn those keys, the celebration they had so carefully curated would unravel at my hands. My humiliation had lit a fire. And once I decided to act, there would be no putting it out. The first crack appeared like a hairline fracture in glass. Small, subtle, but impossible to ignore once you saw it. It began when the waitstaff moved from table to table, serving dinner. Plates of perfectly roasted lamb and golden potatoes were placed in front of the guests, garnished with fresh herbs. The smell wafted through the hall, rich and mouth-watering. Yet the bride's face twisted slightly when she realized something was off. Not all the tables were served at the same time. Some had food, others did not. A hush of confusion spread, like a ripple on calm water. From my seat in the kitchen I heard it all. Staff members whispered frantically. The chef barked orders and trays clattered. They were confused because certain payments hadn't cleared. My payments. The catering company had called me just the day before, confirming the final transfer. And I had let them know, calmly, firmly, that no further funds were authorized without my approval. I had smiled as I hung up the phone. They didn't know the full story, but they didn't need to. I watched through the small glass window in the kitchen door as the bride's smile faltered. Her perfect picture of a flawless evening was cracking. Guests leaned toward one another, murmuring. The groom, my son, scratched the back of his neck, glancing at his bride for direction. She waved a hand impatiently, trying to dismiss the issue, but tension had already snuck into the air like smoke seeping under a door. "Excuse me," a guest called from one of the far tables. "We've been waiting for over 20 minutes. What's going on?" The bride's face tightened, her cheeks flushed, but she forced a laugh. "Oh, just a small mix-up," she said. Her voice was sugary sweet, but I saw the way her hand gripped the edge of the tablecloth, knuckles pale. I leaned back in my chair, savoring the moment. It was only the beginning. The band struck up a tune, but halfway through, their lead guitarist stepped away from the stage and gestured to the groom. I couldn't hear their words, but I knew exactly what was happening. I had signed that contract too. And the band wasn't playing past the deposit unless the balance was cleared. The groom's face shifted from confusion to panic as he checked his phone. He was probably staring at his banking app, realizing the transfer had never gone through. I tapped my fingers against my purse, calm and steady. Every detail of this wedding had passed through me. Every bill, every arrangement, every final call. I had been the architect of their fairy tale, and now I was quietly dismantling it piece by piece. Inside the hall, laughter dimmed as the energy faltered. Guests began to notice the cracks, the delayed service, the half-played songs, the whispers among the staff. The bride stood abruptly, her smile strained but wide. She announced that everything was under control, that the evening would continue without a hitch. But her eyes betrayed her, darting from the band to the caterers to her restless guests. Meanwhile, I sat in silence, sipping the glass of water a kind staff member had offered me earlier. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even sad. What I felt was something sharper, something colder, vindication. They had humiliated me, cast me out like I didn't matter. And yet here I was, the invisible hand pulling every string. The music resumed, but the joy had dimmed. The guests danced half-heartedly, distracted by the chaos simmering beneath the surface. And I thought to myself, this is only the first taste. The real collapse hasn't even begun yet. Because once I walked out of this kitchen and made a single phone call, the rest of the night would come crashing down like a house of cards. The guests were still buzzing with laughter, clinking glasses, and taking photos when I sat quietly in the small, dim kitchen. The clatter of dishes and the faint aroma of reheated food filled the air, but I barely noticed. My mind was elsewhere, on the humiliation, the silence, and the memories of sacrifices I had made to bring my son to this very day. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap, trying to steady the storm rising within me. If I had learned anything over the years, it was that silence often carried more power than words. Anger would only give them an excuse to paint me as bitter. No, I would let them enjoy their illusion for the moment. From where I sat, I could hear the music start. The bride and groom had entered the hall again for the first dance. The guests applauded. The band played softly. And there I was, hidden like an afterthought, like someone whose presence mattered so little that a kitchen chair was enough. My phone buzzed in my purse. A message from an old family friend who was waiting outside. We just arrived. Where should we sit? I stared at the message for a moment before responding simply. Don't come inside. I'll explain later. It was the first step. Quiet, measured, but significant. The laughter from the hall grew louder. Someone raised a toast. I caught my son's voice, brimming with joy as he thanked the guests for being part of his special day. But not once did I hear him mention his mother. Not once did he even acknowledge that I was there. I thought of the countless nights I had stayed awake with him as a child, nursing him through fevers. The times I had skipped meals so he could have a full plate. The hours of work I put in so he could go to college debt-free. Every stitch of his success had been tied with threads of sacrifice. And yet here I was, tucked away like an unwanted shadow. Picked up my phone again. This time, I opened the folder with all the invoices, receipts, and confirmations for the wedding. The venue deposit. The catering advance. The music band. The decorations. The car rentals. The photographer. Every single part of this event had been arranged and paid for by me. And they thought I was powerless. I scrolled through the contacts. Names of service providers who had answered my calls, responded to my emails, and made promises to me directly. My thumb hovered over one number, then another. A wave of calmness washed over me. The storm in my heart transformed into clarity. When the kitchen door opened suddenly, I looked up. It was one of the servers, surprised to see me sitting there. "Ma'am, are you comfortable? Can I bring you anything?" I smiled politely. "No, dear. I'm fine." He nodded, gave me a curious glance, and left. I exhaled slowly. My smile lingered, not of joy but of quiet determination. Let them dance. Let them toast. Let them believe this evening was theirs to command. By tomorrow their fantasy would unravel. They had mistaken my silence for weakness. They had mistaken my patience for submission. But the truth was simple. Everything they were celebrating had been placed in their hands by me. And just as easily I could take it all back. For now I stayed seated, calm and composed. On the outside I was the picture of restraint. But inside the wheels were already turning, and the plan was set. The kitchen became my sanctuary. Not a place of exile, but the command center of the storm I was about to unleash. Tomorrow they would learn the weight of underestimating me. And when they looked back at this night, they would remember not the music or the lights, but the silence of the mother they had cast aside. I pressed call after call with the same steady voice I used to tuck my son into bed when thunder frightened him. "Hello, this is Mrs. Khan. I need to confirm the Wednesday wedding. Please put everything on hold." Each vendor paused, searched, then gave me the same puzzled reply. "Mrs. Khan, the booking is under your son's name." I smiled into the phone and said, "Not anymore." I felt the old, familiar thrill, not of malice, but of righting a wrong. First came the caterer. I could hear the faint clatter of pans through the receiver as the manager asked why. "Due to a family emergency, I'm canceling the event," I said softly, and he sighed, relieved to close the file. I knew the kitchen crew was already on site, half the food prepared. I imagined their faces when they were told the banquet was off, the steam of labor cooling into disappointment. It was a small, practical cruelty, only because it revealed a truth. Celebrations depend on someone who keeps promises. I had kept enough promises for a lifetime. Tonight I would stop. Next I rang the decorator. "Please pause the floral installations," I ordered. I could hear the florist's confusion turn into irritation. "Ma'am, we're already out there," I cut in, steady as a metronome. "Then call your trucks back. No more deliveries." I pictured the garlands half-woven, the centerpieces coming undone, roses left to wilt in transit. Their perfection was suddenly fragile. The image warmed me strangely, a fairy tale unpicked one ribbon at a time. The band's manager was curt when I called. "We expected the client to clear the final balance," he snapped. I let him talk his way into panic. "We will not perform without payment," he told me, and I felt a neat, cold satisfaction. Music stopped when the money did. I could already hear the silence pressing into the hall like snow. As each line on my mental checklist clicked into place, a calm took over that was not exhaustion but clarity. I wasn't exacting revenge to hurt. I was reclaiming dignity. Every phone call was a reclamation. Every cancelled service removed another layer of the charade they had built on my expense. From the kitchen window I watched the hall through the small glass. The chandeliers were still bright. The guests still drank and laughed, unaware the stage was tilting underneath them. A bridesmaid rushed by with a clipboard, eyes wide, asking someone on the phone what to do. The groom, my son, paced near the doorway, his phone glued to his ear. His face the color of someone watching a cliff edge give way. Then a belligerent shout sliced the air. The band had stopped. A dozen heads turned. Conversations faltered. The bride's forced smile snapped like brittle sugar. Her mother's lips whitened as she searched for someone to blame, then looked right at the kitchen door where my shadow sat in a wooden chair, composed and quiet. A staff member poked his head in, panic written on his brow. "Ma'am, they're asking about payment. Things aren't proceeding." He didn't need to say more. His eyes met mine, and in that moment I saw pity, but also an odd respect, someone recognizing that I had pulled back the curtain. My son finally stormed into the kitchen. His face was raw with fear and fury. "What have you done?" he demanded. His voice trembled, not from accusation, but from the panic of a man whose foundation is suddenly gone. I met him with a steadiness I had not felt when changing his diaper, when sitting up with him through fevers. "I asked the vendors to pause," I said. "I told them there was no authorization to proceed. I imagined you would have stood with me, but you chose to stand with her." For a moment his anger tried to mask something else, shame flickering, then retreating. He opened his mouth, closed it, and the hollow rehearsed lines dissolved. "You could have told me," he whispered, less a reproach than a plea. "I did," I answered, and the truth landed heavier than any raised voice. "I told you earlier to include me, to respect me." Tonight they chose an image over the woman who built that image. I will not be invisible in my own life. The hall beyond the kitchen erupted into confusion, a single thread severed and the whole tapestry loosening. People rose, whispered, checked phones, paced. The bride's face crumpled, not from humility but from the terror of plans collapsing. I remained seated until my son's shoulders sagged, and he looked at me not as the boy I raised but as a man realizing his choices. I didn't shout. I didn't plead. I let the sounds of the unraveling swell and carry the message for me. Humiliation returns to those who inflict it. When the first guests began to leave, heads bowed and photos unsent, I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a long time: relief. It wasn't applause I sought. It was recognition. Simple, unvarnished recognition that I existed, that my life mattered beyond being a prop in someone else's perfect picture. I folded my hands in my lap and breathed in the warm kitchen air that smelled of spices and burnt sugar. Out in the hall, the celebration dissolved into 1,000 small crises. Inside, I sat calm as if nothing had happened, though everything had changed. The decision I'd made in silence had begun to teach them a hard lesson. If you erase someone's worth, expect the picture to fade. And when they finally looked back at me, the face they saw wouldn't be the bowed, forgotten woman they assumed. She would be the one who chose herself over performative respect. The wedding hall was no longer a hall. It was a battlefield littered with broken plans. Half-filled glasses stood abandoned on white tablecloths. Untouched plates went cold, and the once cheerful music was replaced by restless whispers. The silence was heavier than noise, the kind of silence that makes people shift in their seats, desperate for someone else to explain what went wrong. I sat in the kitchen, listening to the echo of my choices ripple outward. For years, I had been the woman who smoothed chaos, who stitched broken edges, who stayed silent to keep peace. Tonight I had finally let the fabric tear. The bride was the first to crumble under the weight of that silence. She stormed across the hall in her glittering gown, every step of her heels striking the marble like a drumbeat of desperation. She barked orders at the staff, waved her manicured hands, demanded that someone, anyone, fix what I had undone. But the vendors had already packed their trucks, the musicians carried their instruments into the night, and the flowers were left wilting in buckets by the door. Money could not buy back time, and her authority collapsed with every unanswered demand. Her mother followed behind, her voice shrill, cutting through the air like broken glass. "This is sabotage. Who will pay for this? Who is responsible?" She knew. Her eyes flicked toward the kitchen more than once, her rage pressing against the door like a storm. Yet she didn't dare step inside. Perhaps she understood that this was not her arena. My son, however, lingered on the threshold. He didn't enter fully, nor did he leave. He stood caught between two worlds, the one where his new bride screamed for control, and the one where his mother sat calm, unmoving. His eyes, those same eyes that once searched for me in crowded rooms when he was small, now avoided mine. I knew he wanted to ask me to relent, to undo the damage with a single phone call. But he also knew that my silence meant the moment had already passed. Guests began to leave. Some shook their heads, others whispered behind hands, their curiosity sharper than their sympathy. A few avoided eye contact entirely, ashamed to have witnessed a family fracture so publicly. The bride's friends gathered around her, murmuring words that fell flat against the reality unraveling before them. The perfect wedding she had dreamed of had turned into a spectacle, and not the kind she could ever post about or frame in an album. I felt no guilt as I watched from the shadows of the kitchen. What I felt was something quieter, steadier, like watching a storm break after years of drought. This was not revenge for its own sake. It was a reckoning, a reminder that I was not disposable, that my presence and contributions could not be erased without consequence. When the last of the vendors wheeled their carts away, when the decorations were half dismantled and the bride's makeup streaked with tears, I finally rose from my chair. The staff parted for me without a word. Their eyes followed as I walked across the floor, my steps slow but deliberate. I wasn't there to explain or apologize. I was there to leave on my own terms, before anyone could once again push me into the shadows. I passed my son on the way out. He looked at me, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came. Perhaps he wanted to ask why. Perhaps he already knew. I paused only long enough to place a hand briefly on his arm. It was not forgiveness, nor was it condemnation. It was a touch heavy with meaning. I raised you to stand tall, but if you bend toward those who belittle me, then you must bear the weight of that choice. Outside, the night air was cool against my face. The city lights flickered in the distance, indifferent to the chaos I had left behind. I inhaled deeply, filling my lungs with a kind of freedom I had long denied myself. For the first time in years I felt truly seen, not because anyone in that hall respected me, but because I had demanded my own respect. The silence behind me stretched, growing heavier with every passing minute. Let them sit in it. Let them taste the discomfort of a world without the woman they tried to erase. I stepped into the car waiting for me, and as the driver pulled away, I didn't look back. Some storms are meant to wash away illusions. This one had done its work. The morning after the wedding that never was broke heavy and gray, as if the sky itself understood the weight of what had happened. My phone buzzed relentlessly, but I let it vibrate on the nightstand. Neighbors wanted details, relatives wanted explanations, and a few so-called friends wanted gossip. I had nothing to give them. The story wasn't theirs to devour. It belonged to me, my son, and the woman he had chosen. By noon, word had spread far beyond the reception hall. Guests who had posted glowing pictures of their outfits now whispered shamefully about the scandal. The bride's family tried to control the narrative, painting me as the villain, an embittered woman who sabotaged her own son's happiness out of spite. But people remembered. They remembered the way I had been seated in the kitchen, like a servant instead of the mother of the groom. They remembered the tension, the whispers, the disrespect dripping from every glance cast my way. The truth was harder to bury than they expected. The bride herself went into damage control. Social media became her battlefield. Long captions about toxic family members, heavily filtered photos of her crying in the arms of her friends, attempts to gain sympathy. Yet the comments weren't as supportive as she hoped. Strangers asked, why was his mother treated like that in the first place? Some even said, if she cancelled everything, maybe she had a reason. The more she raged online, the more people questioned the picture she painted. My son called me. He didn't text, he called, which told me how desperate he was. His voice trembled, not with anger, but with exhaustion. Mom, why? Why would you do this? I closed my eyes, his question cutting deeper than he realized. Because, Daniel, I answered softly, I raised you better than to let someone treat me like I don't matter. And yet you let it happen. There was silence on the other end. I imagined him sitting with his head in his hands, torn between the woman he had vowed to protect and the woman who had raised him. It was never meant to be an easy choice. Days turned into weeks, and the cracks only widened. The bride's family refused to pay for the cancelled contracts, leaving my son drowning in debts he never expected. The venue, the caterers, the florists, they all sent bills, and the totals were staggering. My son had no choice but to face the financial fallout alone, because I had already withdrawn my support. The bride grew colder, angrier. Their home, once decorated with engagement gifts and honeymoon brochures, became a battlefield of blame. She accused him of being weak, of not controlling me, of letting me ruin her dream day. He, in turn, accused her of humiliating me, of crossing a line she should have never dared to touch. Their arguments echoed late into the night, neighbors later told me. Meanwhile, I felt no regret. There was sadness, yes, the kind only a mother could feel when watching her child suffer. But regret. Well, regret would mean I believed I should have stayed quiet, and that was no longer in my nature. The lesson was already etched into their lives. Respect is not optional, not even from your own children. Love without respect is nothing but a leash. Weeks later, I received an envelope in the mail. No return address, but I recognized the handwriting immediately. It was my son's. Inside was a short note. "Mom, I don't know where we go from here. But I know you were right. I should have stood up for you. I just don't know how to fix this anymore." I held the letter close to my chest, a mix of pain and pride flooding through me. Maybe one day bridges could be rebuilt. But if they ever were, it would be on foundations of respect, not silence. And as for the bride, the whispers in town said she wasn't adjusting well to a marriage without the fairy tale wedding, the debts piling up like storm clouds. I didn't need to interfere further. Life, I had learned, has a way of balancing its own scales. The day after the wedding fiasco, word spread like wildfire. Friends, relatives, even acquaintances who hadn't attended started calling me, their voices filled with disbelief and sympathy. "She sat you in the kitchen. After everything you did for them." They asked again and again, as though repeating it would make sense of it. But it never did. The truth was simple. I had been humiliated. My son had allowed it. And his bride had orchestrated it. Still, I didn't scream or lash out that night. I had smiled, stayed silent, and left. But silence doesn't mean weakness. No. Silence can be the beginning of something much stronger. I remembered every sacrifice I had made over the years, the countless hours spent building a life that would support my son's dreams. I had worked, saved, and even paid for parts of that wedding, making sure it would be a celebration everyone would remember. And they would remember it, but not for the reasons they had hoped. They thought they had put me in my place, by hiding me away in a kitchen. They thought they had stripped me of my dignity. But what they didn't know was that their disrespect had sparked a fire inside me, one that could not be extinguished. In the quiet of my own home, I reviewed every contract tied to the wedding. The venue, my name was on it. The catering, paid with my money. The decorations, the lighting, the photography, every major piece had been covered by me. They hadn't even realized just how much of it depended on my support. I had been their backbone, the unseen foundation that carried the entire day. And while they tried to erase me from the spotlight, they had forgotten that without me, the spotlight itself would never have been turned on. That realization gave me power. So I picked up the phone. One by one I called the vendors. Calm, polite, professional. Never once raising my voice. "Yes," I said. "Please cancel the remainder of the services." Effective immediately. Some were surprised, others hesitant, but once they realized my name was on the agreements, they complied. By the time I was finished, the beautiful dream wedding they had envisioned collapsed like a house of cards. And I didn't need to cause a scene at the reception. No yelling, no confrontation. Just quiet action. The kind that cuts deeper than words ever could. When the bride discovered what I had done, her rage was like a storm. She called, shouting, accusing me of being bitter and vindictive. But her words didn't sting me. They rolled off like water against stone. Because for the first time I truly understood the balance of power. She had humiliated me in front of others, but I had struck back in a way that couldn't be undone. Money talks, contracts matter, and respect, once lost, cannot be bought back. My son came later, his face pale, his voice trembling. "Mom, why would you do this?" he asked. I looked at him, really looked at him, and for a moment I searched for the little boy I had raised. But he wasn't there. In his place was a man who had chosen silence when I was shoved aside. A man who had stood by as his new wife humiliated me. "I didn't do this to you," I finally said, my voice steady. "I did this for me. For my dignity. Because you may forget what respect looks like, but I never will." The house was quiet after he left. My heart ached, yes, but it also felt lighter, freer. For too long, I had carried the burden of keeping peace, of staying small so others could shine. But that day marked a turning point. I had stood up, not with anger, but with decisive action. And that's the lesson I want anyone listening to hear. Silence isn't always surrender. Sometimes silence is strategy. Sometimes the quietest moves make the loudest impact. They tried to erase me, but in the end they erased themselves. And as for me, I walked away with my head held high, my dignity intact, and the satisfaction of knowing I had written the ending to my own story. Thank you for watching.